All particles are put into the groups hadrons and leptons. Leptons are fundamental particles and they include the electron, muon, that's just a heavy electron essentially, and neutrino, that has no charge and essentially no mass. These will have a lepton number of 1, whereas their antiparticle equivalents have a lepton number of -1. Neutrinos can also be specifically electron neutrinos or muon neutrinos, so you have to treat their lepton numbers separately if an interaction involves both electrons and muons. Hadrons are split into baryons made of 3 quarks and mesons made of 2 quarks, a quark-antiquark pair. So hadrons aren't fundamental particles. The 3 flavors of quark we deal with are up, down, and strange. Up has a charge of +2/3 e, down and strange -1/3. Only strange quarks have strangeness, -1 for a strange quark, +1 for an anti-strange. After all, they are strange. These quarks have a baryon number of +1/3 each, so baryons have a baryon number that isn't 0. It can be +1 or -1 if you have antiquarks in there too. Neutrons are up, down, down. Protons are up, up, down. So you can say the nud and the pood to help you remember them. Anti-up, anti-down, and anti-strange quarks have the opposite charge and baryon number. Pions are mesons that don't have strangeness, whereas kaons are mesons that do have strangeness. We can call them pi+, pi 0, pi-, and k+, k-, k0, etc. to distinguish between them. The electromagnetic force can affect any charged particle. The exchange particle is the photon. We might say virtual photon. It's just a certain way of explaining forces between particles in terms of momentum transferred. Gravity's exchange particle is called the graviton, but you know about those two forces already. Let's go with the two that are new to A level. The weak force, or weak nuclear force, can affect pretty much any particle. Its exchange particle is the W+, W-, or Z0 boson. The strong nuclear force only affects hadrons on the other hand. Its exchange particle is the pion or gluon, if pion isn't an option in a question. This force is what holds nuclei together. The electrostatic repulsion between protons pushes outwards, while the strong force pulls inwards. Okay, a bit of gravity too, but that's really not that much. When these forces are balanced, a nucleus is stable. The range of the strong force is 3 to 4 femtometers, but it switches from attractive to repulsive at 0.5 femtometers to stop the nucleus from imploding on itself. In any interaction, charge, baryon number, and lepton numbers must be conserved, which is why there must be an anti-electron neutrino added in a beta- decay equation to balance the lepton number. We can draw Feynman diagrams to represent these interactions. This will pretty much always be a weak interaction involving a W- boson, say for a beta- decay, or W+ boson for beta+ decay, or electron capture. For normal beta or beta- decay, we can also just say that one of the down quarks in the neutron is decaying to an up quark, and that turns the whole thing into a proton. It goes from nud to pood. Finally, strangeness rules. Here we go. Any interaction involving leptons must be a weak interaction, regardless of strangeness. If an interaction only involves hadrons and strangeness is conserved, it must be a strong interaction. These can create strange particles, though. So, say 0 strangeness goes in, and +1 and -1 for 2 different particles can come out. Total strangeness is conserved. If it isn't conserved, it must be a weak interaction. This happens when strange particles decay. For example, a K0 meson decaying into pi+ and pi- mesons. In essence, the weak interaction is destroying the strangeness, but the total strangeness can only change by + or -1. Specific charge is merely the charge to mass ratio for a particle. Charge in coulombs divided by mass in kilograms. So the unit is coulomb per kilogram. So you'll always end up with a huge number. For example, for an electron, we have a charge of 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 coulombs divided by its mass of 9.1 times 10 to the minus 31 kilograms. Yes, okay, technically minus for the negative charge, but it's really only the magnitude that we're concerned with. A nucleus, say helium-4, that's 2 times 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 for the 2 protons, divided by 4 lots of 1.67 times 10 to the minus 27 kilograms for the mass of the 4 nucleons in the nucleus. A singly charged ion, well, its overall charge is just plus 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 coulombs, just 1 electron. We divide that by the total mass of the nucleus, though. We don't really need to add the negligible mass of the electrons in this case. The term radiation means any particle or wave that's emitted by something. The electromagnetic spectrum is all radiation, but they're all emitted by electrons. Well, all apart from gamma. Gamma radiation is actually emitted by the nucleus of an atom. If it has excess energy, it's getting rid of. Gamma rays are high-energy EM waves. They can be dangerous as they can ionize atoms if absorbed by them, knocking electrons off. This can cause damage to the cells in your body and cause cancer. But there are two other types of radiation nuclei can emit too, but these are actual particles and they're emitted when nuclei decay, change. Isotopes with more neutrons are generally more unstable and more likely to decay. Heavier nuclei like Americium-241 decay by what we call alpha decay. To become more stable, the nucleus will emit a bundle of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, what we can just call an alpha particle. This is alpha radiation. This is what the nuclear decay equation would look like for this to show that the nucleus has decayed into 2 parts. The alpha particle, which must have an atomic number of 2 and a mass of 4. And the daughter nucleus, that's just the nucleus left over, which of course is no longer going to be americium as it's lost protons to go from an atomic number of 95 to 93. Turns out that's now neptunium. You'll never have to remember these elements, you just need to worry about the numbers. It's just maths. 95 goes to 93 plus 2, and the mass is similar. 241 goes to 237 plus 4. There is actually a nucleus that has the numbers 2 and 4. It's a helium nucleus. That's what an alpha particle is. Lighter isotopes, lighter nuclei, like carbon-14 decay by beta or beta- decay instead. What happens is that a neutron in the nucleus turns into a proton and an electron. But the fast-moving electron that's ejected by the nucleus escapes, and we now call this beta radiation. The mass of an electron is basically 0, so we put that on top for that. It has the opposite charge to a proton though, so we say it has an atomic number of -1. Now be careful here, 6 goes to what? Plus -1? No, it's not 5, it's 7. 6 is equal to 7 plus -1. So like we said, a neutron has turned into a proton. So the nucleus has gained a proton, it's gone from 6 to 7. The mass, however, is unchanged, so it's still 14. And don't forget to add the anti-electron neutrino on the end to balance the lepton number. If a particle and its corresponding antiparticle meet, say an electron and positron, they can annihilate, and all of their mass is converted into energy in the form of 2 photons of EM radiation. It's 2 photons, by the way, as momentum must be conserved. And even though photons don't have mass, they still have momentum, weirdly enough. If we're asked to find the minimum energy or frequency the photons made, we infer that they had no kinetic energy. So we just say that energy equals 2 lots of mc squared. We call this either rest energy or mass energy, where c is the speed of light. We can then say this is equal to 2 lots of hf, which is the energy of a photon, Planck's constant times the frequency. The shortcut, of course, is just to split the whole problem in half. We can just say that mc squared for one of the particles equals hf for one of the photons. The opposite can happen when a photon spontaneously converts into 2 particles, if it has enough energy. This is called pair production. This time, hf is equal to 2 lots of mc squared because it's just one photon making 2 particles. If the photon has more energy than the minimum energy needed, the extra energy is supplied to the particles as kinetic energy. It's the opposite for annihilation. If they have kinetic energy before, that also goes into the energy of the photons afterwards. Electrons in an atom orbit the nucleus at specific or discrete energy levels. N1 being the lowest energy level, or ground state, we can call it, then N2, N3, etc. An electron can be excited or raised to a higher energy level either by another free electron colliding with it, giving it some of its energy, or by it absorbing a photon. However, in this case, the energy of the photon must match the difference in energy levels exactly, otherwise it will just pass through. Either way, after it's been excited, the electron will pretty much immediately fall back down to its ground state, emitting photons in the process. We call this de-excitation. But it can take different routes down. From N3, for example, it can either go straight down to N1, or it can go to N2 first, then down to N1. This means there are 3 possible wavelengths or frequencies of photons that could be emitted when it de-excites. From N4, there are 6 different possible wavelengths. The energy of each photon is equal to hf, so the bigger the drop, the higher the frequency of photon emitted, and the shorter the wavelength is, of course. If the incoming or incident free electron or photon has enough energy, however, the electron can reach the ionization level, which then means it's able to leave the atom, leaving behind a positively charged ion. The energy levels can be given in joules or electron volts. 1 electron volt is equal to 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 joules, which should look familiar as it's the same as the charge of an electron. So to convert joules to electron volts and vice versa, just think, do I want a smaller number or a bigger number? You always want a very small number of joules and a normalish number of electron volts. After all, that's why the unit is so handy. Sometimes mega electron volts are even better. You can convert joules to electron volts and then you use your conversion factor of 1,000,000 10 to the power of 6 to get to mega electron volts, but I guarantee it's more helpful to remember that to go from joules to mega electron volts, the conversion factor is 1.6 times 10 to the minus 13 instead of minus 19. An emission spectrum is just a diagram that shows the various wavelengths of photons that are emitted by an object, for example, a star. As different atoms or molecules have specific energy levels, we can tell what particles are found in that star. And then we can also see how redshifted these wavelengths are too, which we can then use to determine the recessional speed of galaxies, for example. An absorption spectrum is obtained when we emit all wavelengths of light through a gas or plasma, that's just an ionized gas, and detect what wavelengths are not transmitted, therefore absorbed. These absorbed wavelengths are represented by black lines on the spectrum. Fluorescent tube lights, strip lights, consist of a cathode and anode that cause electrons to be accelerated through the low-pressure mercury gas inside. An electron will collide with a mercury atom's electron, exciting it to a higher energy level. When it de-excites, it emits a UV photon. That's not useful for our eyes, so it needs to be absorbed by the fluorescent coating on the inside surface of the tube. It raises one of the electrons in the coating to a higher energy level, and then it de-excites via multiple levels, emitting lower frequency visible photons instead. We say photons have wave-particle duality. The photoelectric effect is the main piece of evidence that light acts like a particle. Shine light on certain metals and electrons will be liberated from the surface. They pop off, as they've absorbed the energy as kinetic energy. How can we tell? Well, if we have the metal in an evacuated tube in a circuit with an ammeter, a tiny current will start to flow as the electrons cross the gap. Add a variable PD into the circuit, and we can oppose this current until it reaches zero. We call this potential needed the stopping potential, Vs. We therefore say at this point the kinetic energy of an electron would have to equal QV, or EV, as it's an electron. Bear in mind, this technically gives the maximum kinetic energy an electron has after liberation, as most electrons will have less energy due to them not being right on top of the surface of the metal. We vary the frequency of this incident light and plot the Ek max against this, and we end up with a straight line. The gradient is where Planck's constant comes from. It doesn't go through the origin though, which means that the electron is not gaining as much Ke as the photon's energy going in. It's lost some in the process of being liberated. Extrapolating this line back, and we get this energy which we call the work function. This is the minimum energy required for an electron to be liberated from the surface of a metal. Think of it as an energy toll the electron must pay to escape. The minimum frequency needed to liberate an electron we call the threshold frequency, F0. This means that the work function is therefore equal to h times F0. So here's the full equation. Ek max equals hf minus phi. The kinetic energy the electron has left over equals the photon energy going in minus the work function, the energy toll. This proves the particle theory of light, because if the frequency of light isn't high enough, electrons won't be liberated no matter how intense or bright the light. This shows that one photon is absorbed by one electron. We say it's one-to-one interactions, and that requires photons to be discrete packets of energy. So, light acts like a particle, but any particle can also act like a wave. If we fire electrons at a graphite target in an evacuated tube, we see rings forming on the phosphorescent screen behind. The only way that this would be possible is if the electrons are diffracting as they pass by the graphite atoms and producing an interference pattern with maxima, bright rings, and minima, dark rings. Electron diffraction is the evidence that particles also have wave nature. More on diffraction in waves, of course. The wavelength of a particle is given by the de Broglie or de Broglie wavelength equation. Lambda equals h, Planck's constant, over mv, or p, the momentum of the particle. Faster speed means smaller wavelength, which means less diffraction, according to n lambda equals d sine theta from waves. Here's the standard graph showing how intensity varies with distance from the center. Note that it doesn't decrease to zero, unlike diffraction patterns for light. At this point, it's worth bringing up the fact that you might have to convert kinetic energy into momentum, or vice versa. The trick is this. We know kinetic energy is equal to half mv squared. Multiply both sides by m, and that gives m times e equals half m squared v squared, or half times momentum squared. Let me just rearrange for p. This comes in handy especially in multiple choice questions. So I hope you found that helpful. Leave a like and a comment if you did, and don't forget to check out our revision app to help you test your knowledge, and I'll see you next time.